Hi guys, and welcome to TechFurb. Today we are reviewing the Ryzen 3 3300X. Absolutely. I know it's going to... So, Ryzen 3 3300X. Yes, my previous video showed the build of this machine right here next to me with the 3300X and an RTX 2060. There will be a review coming on the RTX 2060 after the 3300X, so I'm still running the numbers for that. However, 3300X is a very important CPU in this sort of point in buying new computer parts. And even in buying used parts, because what this CPU represents is, in my opinion, the complete and utter decimation of this very long-standing used PC market. So what I mean by that is, for a very long time, you have been able to buy a i5, i7 that's about 3 or 4 years old for a pretty ridiculous markup. So if you wanted to build a budget gaming PC, you're spending a fortune on an old CPU and you're really not getting a lot of performance for it. And you're also not getting a performance bump. That has changed with the 3300X, because while Intel has been pushing forward with 6 core, then an 8 core, and now a 10 core, and AMD as well, pushing high core count processors, they've been expensive. But finally, at the budget end, we get a real upgrade. So, first gen Ryzen, second gen Ryzen in the budget category were good, but their performance wasn't actually, it was matching, but it wasn't exceeding the performance of an old, a 4th gen i7, or even in some cases a 4th gen i5, which is really not a good thing. This CPU now does it. So 3300X, straight out of the gate, if you've watched any review before you've watched this one, given how long that CPU's been out for now, I can imagine you've watched a few. It matches a i7 7700K. So for perspective, when I built my editing rig in 2017 on this channel, you can go look up that video if you want to. The i7 7700K was the best CPU for gaming you could buy. You couldn't buy anything better than that at the time. It was 4 cores and 8 threads. And now, finally, 4 cores and 8 threads for 220 Australian dollars. So US 150, 160, I think it comes in around that price. And the performance is impressive. Now, the CPU I'm going to be comparing it to today is the Ryzen 5 1600. Now, the reason for doing that and not another modern Intel counterpart is because I don't own another modern Intel counterpart. Up until this point, the fastest gaming CPU I have had in my possession is a Ryzen 7 or Ryzen 5 1600, 1700 respectively. So, not very good gaming CPUs. Pretty much anything Intel offered would kick the crap out of those CPUs. Well, in terms of the new offerings. 3300X, that is not the case. To beat the performance of this CPU, you really have to spend money. You've got to be buying an i5 10600K or something like that, and they're quite expensive. For reference, I did look at buying one of those for the channel, and when I saw it was about 400 Australian bucks, I went, screw that. I'm going to buy the CPU that represents the channel the best, and that is a bang for the buck budget CPU. So, with all that preamble aside, let's have a look at how the Ryzen 3 3300X performs, and then we can discuss what that means. Okay, so for the benchmarks, we will be running my sort of current 2020 test suite, which has changed a little bit since the start of the year. There is 13 games, and then we have about 5 CPU specific benchmarks, or 4 or something like that. But let's dive in. So the first game that I start off with is CSGO. And yes, brutal. You did see this in the previous video if you've not watched that before. This is a pretty brutal result. 327 on average against 198 on average. Yeah. yeah, not good from the Ryzen 5 1600 on CSGO. It gets a lot better from here. This is the worst showing for the Ryzen 5 1600. But it's good to see that the AMD has jumped forward in a title that it really struggled in. So if you're looking at an Intel CPU, it's going to be getting around that frame rate. So, you know, 3300X, pretty cheap offering, pretty hard to pass it up. But we'll get into more a bit later. So, this is CSGO. It's absolutely obliterating it. We're happy. Moving on. We have Dirt Rally 2.0. This is a game that scales reasonably well. It's not heavily intensive, but 3300X does have a slight edge over the Ryzen 5 1600. We're looking at about 6-7%, but if we were benchmarking with something a bit higher tier, so not an RTX 2060, maybe a 2070, 2080, or 3070, 3080, that graph would just extend out even further. The Ryzen 5 would stay where it is, and then the 3300X would just extend its lead even ridiculously further beyond. So we can say without a doubt that it is making the most of the 2060, which is very good. I'll go more into that in the review of the 2060 as well. Now, F1 2019, we see a similar story, although it is a little bit more brutal. So 162 versus 130. Yeah, that's a bit more. It's about 15 to 20% off the top of my head. And I mean, what do we want? You know, the Ryzen 5 1600 is not doing bad. It's running the games. It will be interesting to do some regression testing. So I'm really wanting to go back and test these older Intel CPUs against 3300X to sort of compare how, you know, a used CPU versus a modern CPU. We'll get more into that in further videos. So next up we have GTA 5, a game that Ryzen has traditionally struggled in. It tends to struggle in older titles. GTA 5 is no exception, being a game that realistically was released in 2013. I know on PC it technically released in 2015, but it's a game from 2013. I can probably guarantee not much new was added to it. It was just sort of ported across and a few things added to it. Anyway, besides the point, 113 frames per second versus 85. That is a brutal thrashing. You're looking at about 30%. And I have to say, in all four of these benchmarks, in fact, in all of the benchmarks, no spoiler alert, 3300X is a gem of a CPU. It's just a really good CPU. It's getting the most out of the 2060. So yeah, at this point, I'm pretty convinced that you shouldn't really be buying anything else. That is if you can get it. Next up, PUBG. So, 169 versus 136. Similar story. Yeah, I mean, the Ryzen 5 1600, you can really tell how far behind the game the first gen Ryzen was. It was a fantastic compute CPU, and that's why I purchased them. But yeah, in gaming performance, it just wasn't there. It just couldn't match Intel. But we can see here, 3300X is doing a good job. So, next up, Apex Legends. And this is the first game where the 1600 actually beats the 3300X. So, go 1600. It beat it by 3 frames per second. So, gonna say that's margin of error. But it's sort of tells us that Apex Legends doesn't really care what CPU you use. It must be a GPU-bound game. So that's good to see. Very well optimized. We will move on. Next is Battlefield 5, a game that continues to be strenuous on PCs. Even with an RTX 2060, we are looking at 79 frames per second on average for the 3300X. 1600, 74 frames per second. And I should mention at this point as well, all my benchmarks are done on high settings. I can go lower for CPU benchmarking, but when I benchmark, I like to sort of be realistic. You know, if you're buying a 3300X, you're buying a 2060, you're cranking that slider as high as it'll go. And that sort of happy ground is the high settings. I'm not going to put it on ultra. That's a little bit ridiculous, but high is, you know, where I'd put most of my games. Next, Assassin's Creed Odyssey. Again, the lower frame rate games, we're not seeing a big discrepancy between the 1600 and the 3300X. So, 75 versus 68, it's noteworthy, but it's also getting close to margin of error. It's a genuine win, but it's not that fantastic. Again, we're seeing a bit of a trend, so we'll examine that a bit further on. Next up, Far Cry New Dawn, 99 versus 84. That scaling thing. So when you scale it from 60 versus 70 to 80 versus 100, the scale looks a bit bigger. So that is a genuine win again to the 3300X. You're looking at about 15% performance uplift. And yeah, I mean, let's be honest, it's buttery smooth. It's doing the job. Yeah, I'm not really seeing any evidence to go higher up the product stack. Next title, Ghost Recon Breakpoint. 108 versus 105. Very interesting result. Again, margin of error, slight win to the 3300X, but given how close the result is, I'm going to call it a tie. And it tells me that the Breakpoint game is a GPU-bound game, not a CPU-bound game. So that's interesting to note. So we'll move on. Next up, this is the first proper 2020 title in my suite. I know there's a couple of other new games in here, but Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020. Brutal game. And the 3300X does not escape its wrath. 42 frames per second on average. 24 1% lows. 12.1% lows. We stutter into unplayable frame rates. So, this may look like a bad outing, but Flight Sim is a hard game. It's torturing even high-end systems at this point. It's sort of the new can it run Crisis, but now it's can it run Flight Sim. So it can run Flight Sim. And to be honest, playing Flight Sim, it's not a high-fidelity game, so it was playable as far as I was concerned. Basically, I just sort of have a standard flight that I'm doing, and I put it in autopilot mode so I don't have to fly the bloody plane, because I couldn't figure out how to take the plane off the ground, but let's ignore that fact. And the 1600, even though it has more cores and threads, it just can't compensate for that. So there we go. Frequency-bound Flight Sim 2020. Next, Doom Eternal. The graphic you're looking at is very different to the graphic I'm looking at, because the scaling is absolutely broken in this game. 221 versus 203, and for reference, it's it's off the scale, so I need to adjust the scaling. Whoops. Anyway, it is a win to the 3300X. We're looking at a 10% jump in performance. Sounds about right off the top of my head. But Doom Eternal runs on anything, and it's buttery smooth on both CPUs. Doom Eternal is just a really easy game to run. High preset as well, so, pretty happy with the 3300X in this one. Last game, The Outer Worlds. Now, The Outer Worlds is a game where I had traditionally thought it was more GPU than CPU, but it turns out that is not true. So, 121 versus 114. The 0.1% lows drop down a fair bit, but that's sort of natural this game. It's not a very super well optimized game. It does stutter and hitch on pretty much any system I've tried it on. But regardless of the point, both CPUs are running it. Slight win to the 3300X. Now, let's move on to synthetics and CPU. So, 3D Mark Time Spy. If you ever wanted a graph that told you that synthetic benchmarks don't make sense, this is it. So all of that data we've just had, the 3300 smacks the R5 1600 around and flogs it. Yeah, it just got beat in 3D Mark Time Spy. So yeah, there you go. It's a slight victory. I would guess that is down to the physics test, possibly, given it is the same GPU. But let's be honest, we just looked at 13 games and tells us a different story. So we're going to ignore 3D Mark Time Spy and move on. Cinebench R20 multi-core. Now, I didn't show this in the preview video. Have a look at how dead close these two CPUs are. if you don't know the context, the Ryzen 3 3300X is a 4-core, 8-thread part. The Ryzen 5 1600 is a 6-core, 12-thread part. So it's got 50% extra threads and cores, but the 3300X matches it. So that shows you how blisteringly fast that CPU is in single-core performance. And that sort of tells us a big story about what this CPU is meant for. So we'll get into that in the conclusion. Now, single core demonstrates my point. 498 versus 357. Very big deficit. 3300X is much better at single core workloads. It is a huge jump in just 2 generations. So well done to AMD for the Zen 2 architecture. I'm going to be very interested to see the Zen 3 benchmark when they come out in the next couple of weeks. Obviously, I'm a small YouTuber, so I don't get privy access to that information before it goes live, so I don't have benchmark samples. But yes, very interesting looking at R20. So moving on. Blender render. So lower is better. Ryzen 5 slightly, ever so slightly beats the 3300X by a couple of seconds, but we're going to call it a tie because basically it's margin of error territory. So yeah, that's where we're at with it. Multi-core, it's as good as the 1600, and that's not saying a bad thing about the 3300X because the multi-core performance of the 1600 is really good. Even today, when it came out, it was mind-bending. You know, you look at it now and you go, oh, it's only 6-core 12-thread. In 2017, if you wanted a 6-core 12-thread CPU brand new, you were paying an absolute fortune for it. And then you had the Ryzen 5 1600 come in, and I was like, I can edit videos on a $300 CPU. You couldn't do that on a $300 CPU at that point. So it was just mind-blowing. Okay, next benchmark. Handbrake. So this is a render of H.264 render. So, you know, if you're re-encoding videos on, say, a Plex server or something like that, that's what this workload is. And you can see it's pretty much a dead heat. So it's very interesting to see that in the multi-core workloads, it doesn't really matter. And that is the last benchmark. So, conclusion. My thoughts on the 3300X. I actually have a lot that I haven't said so far. So, wrapping up the data in a ball. Gaming performance, this CPU is absolutely phenomenal. It is not the best CPU on the market. The best CPU on the market is going to be an Intel CPU, asterisk, until Zen 3 launches, and it looks like they'll probably topple Intel off that crown. We'll see. But as it stands right now, for CPUs you can buy, this CPU, if you are pairing it with an RTX, I'm going to say 2070 down, so not 3000 series, RTX 3000 series, this will bottleneck it. But 2000 series, so basically anything sort of upper mid-range down, this CPU is going to keep up with it. So I'm very pleased with this as a gaming CPU. I'm actually quite impressed with how it performed in multi-core workloads. Again, I'm very familiar with first-gen Ryzen and how it performs in multi-core. The fact that this matches the 1600, incredible. It's absolutely incredible for the price it is. Now, the other thing to note, performance on the system. It only has 4 cores and 8 threads. And 4 cores and 8 threads is an interesting thing for me. So I'm used to working with high core count in my workstation. So I've tried to use this system as a workstation for a little bit, just to get a feel for it. And I must say, I would use my 1700 as a daily driver for work over the 3300X. And the reason for that is because if you're using workstation use, those, you know, slower high core count processors, they make a huge difference. It's just the 3300X is really, really fast until all 8 threads fill up, and then it slows right down. So if you are absolutely creaming that CPU, it will struggle in it'll struggle in high thread count workloads. So that CPU, I would not buy it if I'm building an editing rig, as good as the multi-core performance is. I would be buying a 3600 at a minimum, ideally 3700X or the equivalent Zen 3 parts when they come out, because they are literally a month away from launching, less than that at this point. Yeah, so that's where I'm at with that CPU. I'm very impressed with the performance, so absolutely for a budget gaming build, it's fantastic. Although if you're pairing it with like a 1660 or something that's on an RTX card, even then I'd say it's probably overkill, where you're probably looking at more of 3100, or you know, if there's a cheap Intel offering as well, go for that. Yeah, but if you are looking to build a solid gaming PC that is a mid-range or upper tier sort of budget build, so 1000 plus, absolutely this CPU. It will pair with just about any graphics card on the market that you can afford to buy, because no one can afford a 2080. Well, very few people can afford a 2080. Very few people can afford a 2080 Ti, 3070, 3080, 3090. They're just cards that are just too expensive. I run a YouTube channel and I can't justify spending the amount of money required to get one of those high-end GPUs. So that kind of says a lot. So I would absolutely recommend buying this CPU. I am going to be very interested to see how it compares to the older CPUs. Off the top of my head, I remember the R5 1600 was slightly ahead of, well, it was ahead of anything that was an i5 4th gen backwards. This will cream anything that's an i5 4th gen backwards. 3770, 4770, that was interesting because 3770 got close and occasionally it did beat the 1600. However, I suspect that the 3300X would absolutely destroy that CPU. So yes, it is going to be very interesting to start going through and doing the regression testing against this CPU, and then I can get a full understanding of how the used market CPUs perform against the new stuff you can buy, because up until this point, it has been very difficult to justify buying new CPUs when you can get really good used CPUs, but I think this has changed that game. So thank you very much for watching, guys. Leave a like if you've liked it, dislike if you've disliked it. I know it is a longer piece of content, but I like to have detailed reviews, and I know that most of my viewers, my regular viewers, love the longer content, so I'm going to keep doing this sort of content. Get subscribed if you're not subscribed. Hit the notification bell because I am trying to ramp up production again, hence the purchasing of this CPU. And yeah, Discord server's there if you've got any questions for me. And thank you for watching, guys, and I'll catch you in the next video.